They searched for her for 8 years. They searched with dogs and helicopters and door-to-door canvassing and the full apparatus of an Austrian police investigation that, at various points, involved hundreds of officers and generated thousands of leads. They searched with the specific urgency that the disappearance of a 10-year-old child on her way to school on a February morning in Vienna generates. The kind of urgency that does not diminish easily, because a missing child is not an abstract problem. They never found her. Not because she was dead. Not because she had been taken across a border or hidden in a location too remote to locate. Because she was 3 kilometers from where she had disappeared, in a room that did not exist on any building plan, in a basement that had been constructed specifically to not be found, beneath the garage of a house in a residential neighborhood that police had searched, had visited, had cleared. In the early days of the investigation, she was there. She was alive. She was 10 years old when they stopped finding her and 18 when she stopped waiting to be found. What happened in those 8 years in a room measuring less than 6 square meters is not a survival story in the way that the other stories in this series are survival stories. There was no desert to cross. There was no ocean to drift across. There was no mountain to descend. There was a room, and a door that did not open from the inside, and a child who became a young woman in that room, and who survived it in the only way a person can survive 8 years in a place designed to hold them, by refusing, against every pressure the situation applied, to stop being herself. This is the UNLOST Files. And this is the true story of Natascha Kampusch. On the morning of March 2, 1998, Natascha Kampusch left her mother's apartment in Vienna's 22nd district to walk to school. She was 10 years old. The route was familiar. The morning was ordinary. She did not arrive at school. The investigation that followed her disappearance was extensive and ultimately unsuccessful in the way that investigations into abductions sometimes are. Not through lack of effort, but through the specific difficulty of finding a person who has been deliberately hidden by someone who prepared the hiding place in advance. Wolfgang Přiklopil, a 35-year-old communications technician who lived alone in a house in the Vienna suburb of Strashof and der Nordbahn, had been building the room for years before the morning he used it. The room was in the basement of his house, accessible through a concealed door in a shelving unit in the garage. It had been constructed with soundproofing, with a reinforced door that required an electronic mechanism to open, with ventilation that made it survivable but not comfortable. It was approximately 5 square meters in its initial configuration, a space roughly the size of a large walk-in closet, with a ceiling low enough that an adult could not stand fully upright. There was a light that could be controlled from outside. There was a toilet. There was a sink. It had been built for a person. It had been built for her. The police investigation into Natascha's disappearance identified Přiklopil as a person of interest in the early days after her disappearance. A witness had noted a suspicious white van near the location where she was last seen, and Přiklopil owned a white van. He was interviewed. His house was visited. The room was not found. The investigation continued for years. Other leads were pursued. Other theories were developed. The file on Natascha Kampusch was never officially closed, but the active investigative focus diminished over time in the way that investigations do when years pass without progress and resources are finite. She was in the room the whole time. The psychology of long-term captivity is a field that has been significantly shaped by the accounts of people who survived it and chose to speak about it afterward. Natascha Kampusch is among those people. Her book, published in 2010, and the interviews she has given over the years since her escape constitute one of the most detailed first-person accounts of extended solitary confinement that exists in the public record. What those accounts describe is not simply endurance. Endurance implies passivity, the ability to absorb what is happening without being destroyed by it. What Natascha describes is something more active, more deliberate, more resistant than endurance. She read. Přiklopil allowed her books, and she used them the way that people in constrained circumstances have always used books, as exits. Not literal exits. Exits from the specific here and now of a 6-square-meter room, into places and times and minds that the room could not touch. She read whatever was available. She read obsessively. Reading was not a pastime in that room, it was a survival strategy, a way of maintaining a mind that the room was, through isolation and sensory deprivation and the constant presence of her captor trying to unmake. She maintained her own sense of time. This is a detail that appears in accounts of long-term captivity as one of the primary psychological survival mechanisms. The insistence on knowing what day it is, what time it is, where in the calendar the present moment falls. In the absence of natural light, in a room whose environment did not change with the seasons or the time of day, Natascha tracked time deliberately. She kept internal calendars. She knew how long she had been there. She did not allow the room to dissolve the structure that time provides to a person's sense of self and continuity. She thought about the outside world as a real place that still existed. This sounds obvious until you understand what long-term captivity does to a person's relationship with the concept of outside. The way that a world experienced only through the descriptions of one person, only through the fragments that a captor chooses to share, can begin to feel less real than the room itself. Natascha resisted this. She held on to her memories of Vienna, of her school, of her family, of the specific sensory texture of a world that had light and air and other people in it, as evidence that those things were still real and still waiting. She was not simply surviving the room. She was refusing to become only the room. The relationship between Natascha Kampusch and Wolfgang Přiklopil over 8 years of captivity is one that she has addressed with a specificity and nuance that resists the simple categories that the public discourse around such cases tends to impose. She has described it as complex, not in a way that excuses what he did or minimizes it or produces any ambiguity about the fundamental nature of the situation. She was a prisoner. He was her captor. The power differential between them was total and absolute from the first day to the last. But complex in the way that any prolonged human relationship in close quarters is complex, because human beings are not simple, and because Natascha Kampusch has insisted, consistently and with considerable force, on the right to describe her own experience in her own terms rather than in the terms that others find more comfortable. She has been criticized for this complexity. She has been misunderstood because of it. She has also, in refusing to simplify, produced one of the most honest accounts of psychological captivity in the literature on the subject, an account that serves the understanding of how people survive such situations better than a simpler account would. What she describes underneath the complexity is consistent. She was determined not to be destroyed. Every strategy she employed, the reading, the timekeeping, the maintenance of her internal world, the navigation of her relationship with her captor in ways that preserved the minimum space required for selfhood, was in service of that determination. She was going to come out of that room as herself, not as what the room had tried to make her. The years passed in the specific way that years pass in captivity. Slowly in the moment, condensed in retrospect. She grew. The room did not. She had entered it as a child of 10, and she was growing into a person in a space that had been designed to hold a person but not to allow one to develop. She developed anyway, not in spite of the constraints. Around them, through them, in the spaces between them. As she got older, Přiklopil allowed her limited access to the house, to perform cleaning, to cook, to exist in the domestic space of the floors above the room with a degree of supervision that was total and continuous. She was never unsupervised. She was never without the knowledge that the door to the outside world was controlled by him, that any attempt to communicate with the outside would be detected, that the consequences of any action he disapproved of would return her to the room and to conditions more restricted than the ones she had been granted. She did not attempt to escape. Not in those years. Not because she had accepted the situation. She has been explicit in every account she has given that she never accepted it. But because the conditions were not there. Because the calculation of what was possible at any given moment is not the same as the calculation of what is ultimately possible. She waited. She watched. She understood her captor and his patterns and his specific vulnerabilities with the precision of someone whose survival depended on that understanding. She was waiting for a moment. On August 23, 2006, Natascha Kampusch was 18 years old and had been in captivity for 3,096 days. Přiklopil had brought her outside to help wash his car, one of the supervised tasks that had become part of the domestic routine of her captivity. His mobile phone rang. He stepped away to answer it, and in the specific interval produced by that distraction, the moment when his attention was divided between the call and awareness of her, she ran. She described it later as not a decision made in that moment. It was the moment that the calculation she had been doing for years finally produced an output. The conditions were there. The gap was there. Her body made the choice before she had finished thinking through it. She ran through neighboring gardens. She ran to a house where a woman answered the door. She told the woman who she was. The woman called the police. Wolfgang Přiklopil, when the police were mobilized in response to her call, fled in his car and then, in the hours that followed, stepped in front of an oncoming train. He died. Natascha Kampusch learned of his death that same day, in the hospital where she had been taken for evaluation. Her response to the news, complex, human, not reducible to relief or vindication, is something she has written about in terms that, again, resist the simple categories her case tends to attract. She cried, not for what he had done, for what he was, which was the only other person who had been present for the 8 years she could never unhave. Her grief was not for her captor's death. It was something more complicated than that. The grief of a person for whom a chapter had ended that no other living person had shared. She has never apologized for that grief. She has never simplified it. Natascha Kampusch walked out of a basement in Strashof and der Nordbahn on August 23, 2006, and into a world that had spent 8 years assuming she was dead. The Austria she returned to was not the Austria she had left. She was not the child who had disappeared on a February morning in 1998. The 8 years in between had happened to both of them, to Austria, which had lived with the unresolved case of a missing child, and to Natascha, who had lived in the case itself. She gave her first public interview 9 days after her escape, on Austrian television, speaking to a journalist, in a conversation that the network broadcast to a country that had followed her disappearance for years. She was composed. She was precise. She was, by every account of those who watched it, a person who was in command of the account she was giving, who had decided, in the 9 days between her escape and the interview, what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. That composure was not the absence of damage. It was the presence of something that the room had not been able to take from her across 8 years of trying. The self that had gone into that basement at 10 years old was still there at 18. Altered, marked, shaped by what had happened, but there, coherent. Hers. She published her book. She manages the foundation in her own name. She has spoken extensively and on her own terms about what happened to her and what it meant and what it cost. She has never allowed someone else to tell her story in the terms they found convenient. That, in itself, is a form of the same refusal that kept her alive in the room. The room tried to make her into something other than herself. Failed. This has been the Unlost Files. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment with what stayed with you. I'll see you in the next one.